Hi, my name is Richard Young. In the next few minutes, I would like to share with you a brief history of the first 20th century veteran in the Young family. His name was Peter Lester Young. Beginning with his backcountry birth, I will relate his early background, his part in the Great War, that is World War I, and some recollections of his latter life. Advocating that the veterans of World War I suffered shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, much the same as modern-day warriors. On January 5th, 1894, Peter Lester Young was born in southeast Georgia. He lived in a small turpentine settlement called Colon in Clinch County. This area is on the western fringe of the Great Okefenokee Swamp, an area formerly inhabited by the Creek and Seminole Indians. At the time Young was born, some Indians still lived back in the swamps, and they remained in the area even into the early 1900s. The area today is very remote with few inhabitants in that part of Georgia. Cotton may have been king in the South, but turpentine production ruled in this part of Georgia. This photograph was taken near Homerville, the seat of Clicks County, about 15 miles north of Colon. Notice that the face of the tree, called a cat face, had the bark chipped away, allowing the sap to flow. The sap was caught in a tin or a cup, which was dipped when the cup was full. During this time period, the turpentine, resin, and pitch from the southern yellow pine provided naval stores used in building wooden ships as well as being used in medicinal products. The work was hard and dangerous, and there was no area in Georgia more unhospitable, with the ticks, the mosquitoes, yellow flies, rattlesnakes, and alligators. Young grew up in this setting. The year he was born, Grover Cleveland was elected president for a second non-consecutive term, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. The Civil War had ended 29 years earlier, but black and white relationships in South Georgia were still very much like they had been prior to the war. This was 2 years before the Alaskan Gold Rush. Fast forward 20 years to June 28, 1914. Amid high tensions between the powers of Eastern and Western Europe, the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife were gunned down. This action set off the conflict that would be called the Great War. World War I began with Germany and Austria on one side, and Russia, Great Britain, and France, and Serbia on the other. Armed with powerful new weapons of mass destruction such as Big Bertha, the big gun of the Germans, chemical weapons, and new techniques for waging war, battles had never been so overwhelming to the senses. The carnage was tremendous, with millions dying in battle. Determined to remain neutral, the United States only joined the war after several unrelated incidents that provoked public outcry. One of these being a German telegram that was deciphered by British intelligence. The telegram sent to the German ambassador to Mexico offered to help the Mexicans recover territory lost to the U.S. during the Mexican War in 1848. But the U.S. did not join the Allies for almost 3 years after the war, but on April 6, 1917, war was declared. The U.S. immediately put forces on the ground in Europe. Peter Lester Young, now a 23-year-old man, still lived in remote southeast Georgia, but it would not take long for the effects of this declaration of war to touch his life. During World War I, around 4 million men served in the U.S. military, with around one half of those serving overseas. Peter Lester Young was one of these men. Drafted, he was enlisted into the service on June 26, 1918. This is a copy of his draft registration card that was done in Clinch County, Georgia. It was done on June 5th, 1917. This is a copy of Peter Lester Young's enlistment service record. It shows his serial number 3499402 and includes the date of service overseas. As a new recruit, he received about 1 month's training at Fort Gordon, Georgia, before his unit was reassigned to the Western Front in France. In the meantime, the effort of the U.S. forces in conjunction with the Allied forces continued to intensify. Young arrived in France in time to participate in the Moise-Argonne offensive. Young was an infantry soldier in the 33rd Division of the U.S. Army, assigned to Company E of the 131st Infantry. Documented in the book, The 131st Infantry in the World War Narrative Operations and Statistics, the day-by-day narrative relates the heavy combat experienced by the 131st. This book also includes a list of the men in Company E. Young's name appears there with his service number, verifying without a doubt this is Peter Lester Young of Colon, Georgia. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the final major thrust of the war and involved the entire Western Front. Over 26,000 U.S. soldiers died during the offensive, which lasted from September 26, 1918, until the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Young experienced the mud, water, and cold of trench life. He would have listened to the constant boom of artillery firing heavy rounds, the piercing wail of those rounds racing across the sky, and probably he cringed at the ground-shaking explosions that followed. He saw all the carnage and suffering that modern weaponry could inflict upon the human body. In the book, An American Soldier in World War I, edited by David L. Sneed about the letters of George Brown, this is what one corporal wrote relating to this. A large shell had made a direct hit upon 4 boys. All were dead. Limbs were mangled. Bodies were torn. It was a sight revolting beyond description. Another private said this about the horrors of war. Can I ever forget the sight? Shells going in all directions and the rat-tat-tat of the machine gun. It is no wonder there were many stragglers and deserters, particularly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Richard Faulkner, in his article Disappearing Doughboys, describes the increasing numbers of men who lagged behind or directly avoided arriving at the front. Newly arrived replacements were some of the ones accused of straggling. On August 12, 1918, one of the officer's agents reported that the 2,500 men who had just arrived at the division from Camps Gordon and Hancock had been in the service only for a few weeks. Young could have been among this group. His service enlistment card indicated he served overseas from August 18, 1918 through May 23, 1919. However, there is no indication Young's company was involved in any straggling. Contrary to this, Young's recollections include some close-quarter combat while on patrol in a French village. Also, it is documented that in September, the 131st Infantry prepared for the upcoming offensive while located in Verdun, France. On the day the Meuse-Argonne offensive began, Young's Company E helped in capturing 106 German prisoners. This is how it happened. On September 26, 1918, at 1 a.m., the 131st Infantry quietly slipped out of the trenches and stealthily advanced on the German positions. If the Germans had known what was happening, it would have been impossible to advance under the barrage they could have laid down. As the infantry took their position, over 3,000 American and French artillery opened fire on the enemy position. As the infantry advanced, the smoke from the shells were so thick that companies B, C, E, and F got separated from the rest of the battalions. In the ensuing time, they attacked a strong point west of Forges Woods, capturing 106 Germans before catching up with the other units. Peter Lester Young, along with the other men of the 131st Infantry, was exposed to heavy combat, gas attacks, artillery fire, and extreme weather during the 47 days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Their efforts, along with those of thousands of other doughboys, helped to bring about the signing of the armistice. On November 11, 1918, a ceasefire was issued, effectively halting hostilities. The peace treaty would not be signed until 1919, but the fighting was over. In the aftermath, Colonel Joseph B. Sanborn wrote this about the 131st Infantry. Faithful to their trust, true to their traditions, noble in their sacrifice, the men of the Illinois, the 131st Infantry was also known as the Illinois National Guard. Men of Illinois were suffering, wounded, and dying when the curtain came down at the end of the great world tragedy. Young remained in France until May of 1919. His transport documentation indicates his ship departed Brest, France on May 14, 1919. An interesting side note, many commercial and non-military ships were used during World War I. The ship that Young came home on was the Catherine Augusta Victoria. At the time, it was the second largest ocean liner in the world. The USS Catherine, with all its splendor, was sure to have been quite a surprise to the troops on board. Peter Lester Young arrived without incident in the U.S. and was honorably discharged June 3, 1919. In less than 1 year, he had traveled overseas, participated in the greatest conflict ever waged in the world at the time, and returned home to his remote South Georgia home. This is a copy of Peter Lester Young's discharge papers that were recorded in the courthouse in Homerville, Georgia. Peter Lester Young was 25 years old when he returned from the Great War. He married Mary Bell Register February 22, 1925. He and she had 8 children. In 1936, they moved into North Florida near the town of Jasper. Marybelle died in 1945 at the age of 45. Young lived until November 10, 1964. He almost made it to one more Veterans Day. He loved November 11th. He would go to town and sit with all of his other World War I and later with his World War II and Korean veterans. On the bench in front of the drugstore, the men would swap jokes and tales, all of them proud to have served their nation. Young always remembered where he was on that very first Armistice Day, and because of where that place was, he suffered much mental anguish in his life. Post-traumatic stress disorder is defined as a mental health problem that can develop from experiencing a life-threatening experience, including combat. Young definitely had that sort of experience. Aaron, the second oldest son, recalled this story. My father would sit on the front doorsteps in the morning to drink his coffee. One morning he was visibly shaken by some thought. When asked what had upset him, my father replied, "We were on patrol when all of a sudden we came under attack. I ran around the house and almost collided with a young German soldier. I shot him." There was a pause. Then my father said, "Sometimes when I sit here and drink my coffee, he comes and sits with me." After his wife died, he became more reclusive, leaving several children for others to raise. Near the end of his life, he was placed into a mental hospital, suffering from severe depression. When he died, he was given a military funeral. The coffin draped with American flag and taps were played by a lonesome bugle. He was honored one more time for his service.